First, Jonah Primiano is a Los Angeles-based filmmaker, educator, and researcher using the rotoscope technique to both deconstruct and form new relationships between disparate moving images. Employing delicate graphite drawings that interact with negative paper space, his work aims to probe the relationship between culture, image, and meaning. Jonah graduated from CalArts with the MFA in experimental animation in the spring of 2021 and returned this fall as a postgraduate teaching fellow. And I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you, McKenna, and thank you to the After Hours animation community for hosting this and for like setting all of this up. I think it's really inspiring to see the way that this community sort of has come together in the last month, I guess, and in general, just like how animators seem to always find a way to build and connect, even though we're all like so spread out. So it's really inspiring, and I'm just super grateful to be part of this in some small way. So cool. Yeah, let's jump into it. Thanks for that introduction. I don't really think I have anything else to add, but I thought maybe some geography, and also just to say that, like, yeah, I'm from the East Coast, from Southern Massachusetts. I have a BFA in animation from the Savannah College of Art and Design down in Georgia, lived in the Midwest for a bit, and then moved out to Los Angeles to get an MFA in experimental animation at CalArts. So just to sort of place me that way, if that helps anybody. But before we jump into the talk, I did want to share a document in the chat. With this type of talk, usually I would like to not only talk about like my ideas and some of the sort of more like theory, philosophical side of things, but also like talk about the way that it relates to animation being made in the world, or as it has been made in the world. But just to try to keep things tight tonight so I don't go over somewhat of a time, I decided to make a document that just sort of goes along with the talk, that has a bunch of different films that like correspond with some of the ideas I'm talking about, because I won't really have time to fully get into them, because I'd like to focus on the ideas and then some of my own work in relation to that. So I'm just going to quickly share that into the chat. There's that. Obviously, maybe wait till after the talk to start watching those films, but there they are. So, all right. So now let me pull up the slideshow and I can share my screen and we can get into it. Just a sec here. Okay. Cool deal. So let me hit play. Yeah, now that we're in the slideshow, I definitely won't be able to, or I don't think I'll really be able to see if anyone's talking in the chat or anything. So feel free to interrupt or say whatever, because Zoom gets kind of weird with full screen. So anyhow, let's jump into it because there's a lot I want to cover. All right, so yeah, the image gazes back, Rotoscope and Demystification. That's the title of this talk. I think really I wanted to just lay out like a basic structure real quick before we jump into it, but I think you'll all see sort of how this kind of builds on itself throughout the talk, my ideas, and like how they relate to images, how they relate to rotoscoping, and then how that feeds into this idea of demystifying or clarifying or sort of breaking things down through that process. But I also wanted to say that this process of demystifying also mirrors my own progression with the rotoscope technique over the last 3 years of using it. It's something that I've been like primarily focusing on for about 3.5 years now. And so I tried to build this talk in a way that not only like uses the ideas that I've been like formulating over those years, but also uses my work starting from a place of like not knowing what I was doing to now trying to maybe understand what I'm doing. And I hope that like by presenting things that way, that can be helpful to any of you that maybe are new to animation, new to rotoscoping, students, anything like that, just to see maybe the way the way I've kind of figured things out, and maybe that'll be helpful like in your own practice or your own development or trajectory getting into animation or filmmaking or whatever it is. So yeah, with that laid out, let's get into it. Let's move forward. Since this is a talk that's basically all about rotoscoping, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of start here, which is this question of what is rotoscoping. And I think that I assume a lot of you are pretty familiar with the process, especially because we had Lige also talking about rotoscoping a couple of weeks ago, which was a really interesting talk and workshop that was really fascinating to see the way that Lige, you work with like totally kind of hybrid processes. This is going to be coming at things from a bit of a different angle, but but anyhow, just to say off the start that if anyone is like not totally sure what rotoscoping is, it's really just a process of drawing over source footage one frame at a time, and to recreate its movement. Historically, that's been done by like cartoon animation studios to make smooth, what they would call like smooth or realistic cartoon movement. Of course, that's sort of like relative, but that's kind of why it was employed in the first place. On the left, you're seeing an image from the Rotoscope patent from 1917, which was patented by Max Fleischer, and then sort of through his studio, Fleischer Studios. So what you see, though, is sort of the apparatus that he invented and patented, which is this kind of back projected image device that throws an image onto a pane of glass that then can be traced over by an artist or an animation artist. And then in the case of Fleischer, they would sort of place their cartoons on top of it. I can hit play on here, and you can see a pretty classic clip from one of their films, Betty Boop and Snow White from 1933, where we have this clip on the left being Cab Calloway doing a sort of song and dance, and then the way it's been rotoscoped on the right, which it's sort of interacting with this pretty interesting hybrid space of rotoscoping. But this is sort of the primary way rotoscope was used for the beginning of its life in the early 20th century. Although I will say that I think rotoscope has had sort of a long life even before 1917 and that patent period, but I think that that's sort of a talk for another day. But we can continue going forward. I hope that that was a decent explanation. Just keep sort of in mind, tracing, drawing over footage to recreate some sort of movement to gain something that way. So, okay, so what I wanted to do after we've kind of started there, sorry, I'm gonna try to, here we go. I'm just going to minimize that for a second and hit play again. There. Sorry, Zoom is disagreeing with me. But where are we? Now I can't hit play again. Sorry about this, folks. There we go. Okay. Thank you. Now I can see the full screen. Okay, so what I wanted to say sort of off the top after getting into that general definition of rotoscoping is to try to make a few distinctions between film and animation and the rotoscope in particular. And it's not something that I do, like I don't generally think it's very like a great idea to draw like hard kind of like black and white distinctions between things. Because I think that can like be pretty damaging actually to like some type of conversation about the way that things works, and it can kind of destroy nuance, generally speaking, socially, culturally, artistically. But in the case of the rotoscope, I do think that there are a few things that separate it pretty distinctly from film and animation sort of like as a category, and then rotoscope sort of on its own. In a lot of ways, I do feel like it actually ends up being this sort of hybrid process between the three, of course, as we saw again with Liege and the work that they presented. But there are a few things that separate it. So I'm going to get into that for just a few seconds, and then we'll keep moving forward. But sort of on the left here, what I have is this idea that film and animation operate in a space that we could call pro-filmic space, or sort of pre-image space is a phrase that I'm using here. But that's just this general idea that like the approach that a filmmaker or an animator usually takes to their subject is that there are things outside of the camera, outside of the apparatus, that they are sort of, as I've written here, composing that material to become images, and its output is images. And so there's this relationship with an exterior pro-filmic space that like the filmmaker or animator generally has, and that like they need to rely on this apparatus to translate these exterior things onto a film strip, onto a digital image sequence, onto some type of moving image form. And that kind of defines the basic relationship of film and animation. Of course, there are examples within the history of film and animation that don't necessarily fit within that, and that's fine, but this is like a general scope. And then on the other side of that, we have rotoscope, which operates in this, what I'm calling like a post-filmic or a post-image space, in that to rotoscope basically like presupposes images, it presupposes an image sequence. And so in that very like distinction, there's like a sort of like, it is like, in a way, the relationship is different to the material, in that it's not necessarily a relationship to something exterior to the image. It's not like a pro-filmic relationship. It tends to be sort of by its very nature, by its form, by its relationship to images. It tends to be this thing that is actually like happening in like this post-filmic after image kind of on top of the image space. And then I've written here, it uses existing images to create new ones. And its starting point is film and animation's endpoint. And so I think with that basic delineation, I can move on to this next slide here to continue this. It kind of raises a few different things that happen that I think are kind of like intrinsic to Rotoscope as a form or as an approach. But I'll start again with film and animation on the left, saying that the form tends to speak to something exterior outside of the image. That's already something I've kind of touched on. But then to go on from that it can be, but is not necessarily self-referential. And then like contrasting that, Rotoscope, I'd say that like sort of by its nature tends to be something that is inherently self-referential. And what I mean by that is that, or like I think what comes of that is this I believe that that's where like this uncanniness of Rotoscope comes from, and that it's usually pretty obvious to even, I'd say, people that aren't filmmakers or animators, when they're looking, like most people are able to pick up when they're looking at a rotoscoped piece of material, even if they don't know exactly what they're seeing. There's something about rotoscoping that sort of calls attention to itself naturally. And I think it's this distinction, which is that the process itself is something that is happening sort of on top of images, of course, by tracing, and that its relationship actually isn't to something outside of the image really at all. And as I've written here, that the form and the process, because of those things, because of that distinction, tends to be actually more about an analysis of images themselves. And in that way, it speaks to the medium itself. And I want to say here again, I'm going to keep saying this, but it's not that film and animation are not capable of speaking to the medium. Of course, there are incredible, there's so many different references and examples in film and animation history of films that wonderfully are self-referential and do speak to the medium in a number of ways, both within more conventional filmmaking practices and experimental and avant-garde filmmaking. But I think that the important part here for me is just that rotoscoping can't help. It doesn't have the choice to do it or not, I would say. That generally speaking, Rotoscope sort of has to be self-referential, or at least be about images themselves. Where in a film and animation space, there's sort of this idea, especially within conventional film and animation, that the makers of the film sort of want you to look beyond. They don't necessarily want you to be thinking about how it was made. They don't want you to be thinking about the labor. They don't want you to be thinking about the surface of the image. Usually they would like you to be lost in the image, to be lost in the narration, the story, the characters, whatever that might be. And that happens, I think, both, of course, in film and animation in different ways, but that with rotoscoping, it's sort of by its very nature, by the way that it's constructed, kind of breaks that ability to sort of lose oneself in like the film space. And of course, there are examples of rotoscope that is fully integrated into film, and we can think about things like visual effects, and which I think is a bit of a different topic and a bit of a different history. But that does get into this final part here with these ideas of distinctions that I'll end this part on, which is for me, which is starting to become sort of my way of looking at rotoscoping. And now that I've gotten the chance to teach it a little bit, this is sort of the direction that I'm leaning in now, which is sort of this idea of rotoscope the technique, which is, as I've written here, a technical tool used in animation and visual effects production, which is just sort of the idea that, or how I've written actually below it, I'll read that first, how it's been used historically, particularly in the early, mid, and 20th century. But what I'm getting at here is just that, like, for most of the rotoscope's life, before it was readily available to independent and experimental filmmakers in the second half of the 20th century, it really wasn't viewed as an artistic tool or something that like could be used to generate something sort of unique, or that could have some type of relationship with the form itself or to moving images themselves necessarily. It was really just something that studios used as they needed it to produce a certain thing for their films. And this happened in, of course, every studio, not just Fleischer. It happened at Disney and any other studio you could really think about, whether or not they're going to be honest about whether or not they've rotoscoped or not, they have, Then, so that the opposite of this, of course, is what I'm starting to frame the way that I view rotoscoping, which is more of rotoscoping the gaze. And then, the statement I've written below is maybe a little bit aspirational, but it's sort of what I've written is that rotoscoping can be an experimental and exploratory approach to images and media, which leads to this notion of rotoscope not instead of it being a technique, it being this gaze, or what I've written here, the rotoscopic view, which is sort of the way that I've started to talk about rotoscoping when approached from this way of less of a tool and less of a means to an end, but more of an analysis of the form itself, of something that's happening after film and animation, something that, although it actually was born at the same time as film and animation, it couldn't exist without those two already existing. And so in that way, it to me starts to become this practice or this process that is pretty uniquely qualified, I would say, to be commenting on film and animation and the nature of images and the nature of moving images in particular, just because of this relationship, this sort of post-filmic, post-image kind of analytical framework that Rotoscope kind of exists within. And so yeah, I know that was a lot, but that's where I wanted to start this off, these few distinctions, because I think they kind of inform kind of like the foundation of where I'm at right now, thinking about rotoscoping and bringing it back to this idea of sort of demystification, and this idea of like the image, the rotoscoper gazing into the image, and then the image gazing back, and sort of what that relationship starts to be, and then how that can lead to some process of demystifying, deciphering of the image space in a few different ways. So yeah, I know that was a lot, but let's kind of move forward into the next part of this. And I've written here I've got a few kind of subheadings, and this section I'm going to call looking at images. And it kind of constitutes, for me personally, maybe just transitioning a little bit into my own like trajectory with rotoscoping. This would maybe, because I spent the last 3 years kind of working through figuring out what my relationship is to the technique. We can maybe look at it in a way of that the first year of my practice of rotoscoping would be in this mindset of looking at images. And what I mean by that is sort of not really knowing yet all of the things that I just told you. I just laid these ideas on you that maybe sound very formed and solid, but like anyone else approaching a new form or a new way of working, I didn't come to it with those ideas, of course. It's only after working for the last 3.5 years at it, starting to read some more into the theory, starting to formulate my own ideas, that I'm able to come back and kind of look at it in a different light. And so to bring it sort of back now, this would be sort of my trajectory a little bit, and I'm going to include some different text and then a little bit of work from a few other artists as some context as well. So I just wanted to start here with a quote from a book by Laura Mulvey, who I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. She's a pretty not pretty, but extremely well-respected, famous film critic, historian, writer, theorist, very well known for kind of like championing feminist critique in cinema and cinema writing, and then also like championing this idea of the male gaze as well, or at least championing it in like sort of a critical light. Anyhow, she wrote this book in 2006 called Death 24 Times a Second. And this is a book that I only recently actually got the chance to check out. But I wanted to read this quick quote and then talk about how I think that it actually works really nicely with this kind of more exploratory approach to rotoscoping. So she says, delayed cinema works on two levels. First of all, it refers to the actual act of slowing down the flow of film. Secondly, it refers to the delay in time during which some detail has lain dormant, as it were, waiting to be noticed. And I wanted to actually back up just a second. I should have described the book just a little bit. In this book, Mulvey she's talking about the new relationship to classic cinema that we are able to have in the 21st century, which is one that through all of these new processes, through computers, the average person and the scholar and the filmmaker are able to have a way more intense level of control over the filmmaking process and the film viewing process, in that the average person can now stop, freeze, slow down, rewind, fast forward any film that they want to see, and how this is drastically different than the way that film was like consumed for pretty much its entire life until maybe the late 20th century. And so she's kind of arguing that through that new development, that we now are able to approach this way of looking at cinema that she calls delayed cinema, which I think is in my view, a way that like the rotoscope has always approached, or like a rotoscope artist has always approached cinema in this way, in that like they've always needed to go one frame at a time with existing footage to make their choices into rotoscope. But that it sort of now becomes obvious and useful to everyone else when it becomes sort of massively available. But what I really like about this section is she talks about how, yeah, some detail has lain dormant, waiting to be noticed. And I think that that to me is like really exciting when approaching rotoscoping, and looking at images, because there is so much that obviously one can miss when images are flying by sort of at full speed. But when slowed down and really able to spend time with an image, not just as a rotoscope artist, but maybe in particular as a rotoscope artist, there are so many things that can be pulled out of an image that become more interesting than the actual moving sequence itself. Excuse me, which actually leads me to this next slide, which is another quote by a writer, Hannah Frank. Unfortunately, she passed soon after publishing this book, which is a real shame, because it's an incredible book. It's called Frame by Frame, a Materialist Aesthetic of Animated Cartoons. And in this book, she's really breaking down, she's kind of continuing this Mulvey approach of delayed cinema, but she's applying it specifically to cartoons. And she also, so she talks primarily in the book about cartoon animation and like the Disney studio system, or not just Disney, but really all of those like American cartoons of the 20th century. But she also has a few chapters with Robert Breer as well, who is someone that did a ton of work with rotoscope in the 70s, and who I believe is on the front cover there. But anyhow, her approach in this book is to see that when we slow down an image and look at animation one frame at a time, what can come from that, and what are sort of what can be gleaned from those individual frames one at a time. And in her case, she's really looking at this from more of a labor perspective. And so she's trying to reveal all of sort of like the hidden labor, the hidden marks that are in these individual frames, and how that kind of changes the way that one might have a relationship to animation and cartoons, in particular, knowing the pretty shady labor history of cartoon production, and the way that historically women were kind of sidelined, even though they had very like prominent roles in that production. And so really this book doesn't have anything to do with rotoscoping in particular, but I'll read this quote now after explaining it. She says, imagine not watching a film, but looking at it frame by frame. Bodies in motion would suddenly freeze, their irresistible sensuousness submitting to clinical scrutiny. Minute details in the photographic image would supplant the broader strokes of the narrative. The part would overwhelm the whole. And this is, I think, actually from the introduction. So, but it's sort of like breaking down what she finds appealing by this process. And I do think, again, that this is speaking to the way that a rotoscope artist would has to naturally approach their work anyway. But what I really enjoy about the way she phrases this is, I mean, of course, using the word irresistible sensuousness, that phrasing is really nice, but this idea that the part would overwhelm the whole. And that these minute details actually end up becoming more important than like the sequence itself. And I think that this opens up a wide space, a wide world for the rotoscope artist or the animator or filmmaker, whatever it will be, to explore the image space, to explore the compositional formal space of the image outside of this kind of general framework of like the broader film itself. And so that kind of leads here. I'm not going to cover both of these artists in detail, but they are on the list that I sent you. But I'm just trying to link this to like some of these historical moments. There are artists like Robert Breer and Mary Beams, who are both working in the 70s, making incredible rotoscope work at a time when rotoscope finally sort of seems to have been able to emerge as an independent tool that artists could use and approach. And because of that, because it left the studio system, suddenly there were these artists that began, experimenting with it, and really to great effect. And I think both of these artists represent this kind of playful part, subsuming the whole aspect of seeing what can happen when you slow something down, look at it one frame at a time, and start to approach it formally and compositionally, and to see what can happen in this sort of screen space, image space, that ends up actually maybe sometimes being less about the original film subject and more about this kind of after effect of analyzing and breaking down these images. So check out their work if you haven't. It's on the list that I provided. I wanted to just quickly now tie this into my first year project at CalArts, which for me kind of represents my own period of sort of looking at images. And it was, I think I wanted to kind of quickly run through this feeling that I was having in my first year, because I think perhaps it would be helpful to some of you if you're students or you're curious about going back to school or going to school or whatever it is. But that is to say that when I came into CalArts, you know, it's an extremely, not necessarily competitive in atmosphere, but there's a long history there. There's an incredible amount of like very talented people there making wonderful work. And so there's a sense that one wants to like, you know, live up to that. And when I came in, of course, I was feeling that, and I had never tried rotoscoping before. It was off of my radar. I had gone through, like I said, an undergraduate program that was very kind of rigid and kind of approached rotoscope in this sort of negative light. And so I had a lot of baggage about rotoscope, and I was like, this is not something that I'm going to do. I don't really think much of it. And this is sort of, now you're starting maybe to see this process of demystification a little bit, but you know, I had a project in one of my first semesters with the wonderful animator and teacher Maureen Selwood, who she has everyone to do some rotoscoping, do a quick rotoscope project. And you know, for me, I had a lot of anxiety at that time, because I was trying, you know, everyone in your first year at CalArts needs to make a film. And so I was sort of ramping up to that point, and I was like, oh, I don't know sort of what my angle is going to be or how I'm going to make this film. I don't know what my style really is. You know, there's a lot of people there that come in with a very kind of, you know, a style sort of already worked out, and then as well within CalArts or any other institution, there are always going to be these sort of zeitgeist, these trends that are going through programs and things like that. And at CalArts, of course, over the last few years, you might see a few different trends. One of them, maybe more dominant in experimental animation, tends to be this kind of maybe experimental character animation, we might call it. And so that being sort of in the air, I kept telling myself, oh yeah, well, like naturally, Jonah, you're going to kind of gravitate towards this, and perhaps you'll change or adapt to that style. But it just really wasn't happening, and I couldn't find a way to like incorporate that way of working into my own practice. And I think I should make a note to say that there was no exterior pressure to do this from anyone in the department or any other student. This is really sort of a self-imposed kind of pressure, of course. But it's not nonetheless something that I did feel. So, but then when I finally got the chance to try rotoscoping, to wrap this all up quickly, and in this class with Maureen Selwood, I just sort of threw myself into it, because I was like, I've never really tried this. I don't think I'm going to like it because I have all this baggage, but just go for it. And I don't have the experiment with me, but I made this little clip, and it was really just like a revelatory experience for me, and one that was like just sort of like smashed open like an entire array of possibilities that just didn't really seem open to me before trying it. And that kind of getting at what I've said already a little bit, just this sense that most animation production sort of tends to be caught up in, at least in my view, you know, with things like story, character, narrative arc, general things in that scope, which are fine and wonderful things. And a lot of the films that I enjoy watching like sort of follow those ways of working, of course. But those are things that really just weren't that interesting to me, and were leading to me to have some level of anxiety. And so when approaching the rotoscope and approaching this project and approaching looking at images more generally, you just don't have to work. You don't have to worry about any of those things. It really becomes, when you start to rotoscope on a piece of paper, you have an image that's shining through your piece of paper or wherever you're working. And in that moment, you really just have to just start making choices on the page. And that was extremely exciting to me. In a way, it allowed me to turn off that entire other side of the brain, and then just kind of throw myself into this very immediate, very kind of formal and compositional kind of practice of making choices that have a lot more to do with line and contour and shape, and in some cases color, and how those things translate one frame to the next or throughout a sequence. And so that's sort of, after working on that project and coming to that realization, I really was like, okay, this is it. I'm going to throw myself into this. And so that's how I started to build my first year film. I'll start to hit play on these. And the film itself is it's built out of personal footage that I had shot with myself and my partner over the last few years before I came to CalArts. I knew I wanted to make a film about my dog, about memory. Our dog had fortunately had lost a battle with cancer the year before he moved to CalArts, and so, or sorry, before I moved to Los Angeles, and so that was on my mind, but I had all this footage I wasn't using. And I thought to myself, okay, well, now's a great time to just throw it on a timeline and to begin kind of really just playing with it and seeing what can come from it and to see what sort of translates. But what was more important really was to just start drawing and rotoscoping and making these choices kind of frame by frame. And I set a couple of parameters for myself, which was I didn't want to do any digital compositing. So the entire film is just single sheets of paper. And so what you're seeing is sort of like this manual or maybe analog compositing process which is actually quite simple in that I would just start rotoscoping and maybe rotoscope 10 or 20 or more like 5 or 10 seconds of a sequence kind of straight ahead. And then I would make a choice on the first frame and then I would just sort of see where that went throughout the sequence. And I really was not trying to focus on what was in the images themselves or what existed there already, but it was more like how can I have a relationship with these images while I'm working and see what comes from that. So I would work through an entire sequence and then I would go back maybe halfway through that or all the way back to the beginning, and I would pull up a new clip, like a new reference footage, and then I would just start drawing right over top of what I had already done. And so through that, I started to form these new relationships and these kind of like natural compositions and things like that tended to be sort of somewhat abstract, somewhat visible, and playing a lot with this kind of positive negative space. And so, yeah, that's really how I built kind of that entire film through this process that was very playful, very open. I actually sometimes animation can be like tedious and annoying and whatever, but this is a film that I really genuinely enjoyed making and really loved almost every part of the process of making. And I think it came from allowing myself to kind of break down those walls and to approach it in this kind of more exploratory, kind of looking at images way about having a relationship with the images themselves and not so much about the whole that they come from. Of course, something about the whole is always going to translate and we can't really get rid of that, but yeah, so this is sort of this first section, this first year, this looking at images mode with rotoscoping. But I'm going to leave that there so that we can continue moving forward into this next section, which I'm calling remixing the image. And if what I just went through kind of broadly spoke to my first year experience of working with rotoscoping over this sort of 3-year period, this would be kind of maybe me now in my second year of working with the process and starting to try to contend with some new ideas about the relationship that like someone working with rotoscope might have to images that go beyond personal footage, because up until this point, I had only been working with footage that I had like personal ownership over. And so now I wanted to try to broaden that and take images from culture and media and see how that changed things and see what that relationship's like started to look like. And so to bring it back a little bit to some of these kind of like other people thinking in a similar vein, I wanted to pull up another quote here to talk through, which is, I assume a lot of you are also pretty familiar with John Berger and his book and documentary series, Ways of Seeing. If you're not, I totally recommend checking it out. The documentary it's all free on YouTube. It was a 4-part series on the BBC in the 70s that was sort of maybe like one of the first publicly available like media literacy lessons for like the broad public, and in that way I think is incredibly valuable and something that really everybody needs to see if you haven't seen it. And then also check out the book. The book came after the documentary series. So but anyhow, he's talking about a lot of things in this book, but he's really, at least in the first part, getting at the new relationship formed by reproduced images, photography, filmed things, television, and how that's changing the way that we all relate to images and the way that culture can view images. He gets into a lot of political critique in this book that I think is extremely valuable and will come up later in the talk. But for now, I really like this sort of what I would say maybe is like a call to arms or something for anybody that has a practice around image making and who is interested in like analyzing culture or media. And I'll read this. He says, the art of the past no longer exists as it once did. Its authority is lost. In its place, there is a language of images. What matters now is who uses that language and for what purpose. And I really enjoyed this little sentence, and I've bolded a language of images because, thinking about the 70s, of course, images were proliferating at a pace that they really hadn't been able to before, of course. But if we think about our contemporary moment, I mean, this has really only been magnified in that if we can think about it in the sense that perhaps previous centuries, the main language was that of text, possibly, or maybe just speaking in a kind of a pre-image society, or at least pre-photographic image society. That now we have a language of images. And so the discourse changes in that perhaps the way that we kind of analyze and make sense of our moment is maybe less through text and through word the way that it used to be, and maybe it is through images and moving images in particular, since that's the dominant mode that we all kind of communicate now. And so I just like this idea that, yeah, we have this language of images, and this kind of urging is okay, what matters now is who uses it and then for what purpose. And of course, there's a lot of political implications there, but what's built into that also is how can you use duplicated, replicated, already existing images to say something new about them and to replace them in a time and a history. Okay, so now quickly to just run through one other text. We've got Hal Foster, another pretty well-known art writer, thinker, theorist, and in the early 80s, he edited this book called The Anti-Aesthetic, which is, as you can see, essays on postmodern culture. They were trying to make sense in this book at the time when the idea of postmodernism was still pretty new at that time. A lot of these prominent thinkers and writers were trying to figure out what that meant for society and culture and politics and all the rest, and art, of course. Hal Foster wrote the intro to this book, and I'll just read this quick section. He writes, "A resistant postmodernism is concerned with the critical deconstruction of tradition, not an instrumental pastiche of pop or pseudo-historical forms, with a critique of origins, not a return to them. In short, it seeks to question rather than exploit cultural codes, to explore rather than conceal social and political affiliations." There's a lot to say about postmodernism. Whether or not it's even still a relevant term anymore is obviously up for debate. Regardless, I don't think that any of us can exist outside of postmodernism, and that our culture is really built around reference and reproduction and reuse of images, and thinking about things like memes and the high referentiality of all of that. But regardless, what I think is valuable in this little quote is just what I've bolded here, this idea that as an artist, not just a rotoscope artist, but maybe in the case of this talk in particular, a rotoscope artist, that to operate in a postmodern way, to be using the things that are already existing in culture, to be reusing these things, can actually be a very powerful way to be critiquing things like origins. It can question and it can explore political affiliation, cultural codes, and origins, like he's saying here, and also social affiliations. And I think that that's very powerful because there's I think it just kind of gets back to this idea of of using the things from culture back in on itself to then reveal something that's going on there already. And I think that sometimes postmodern critiques can be a little bit negative or anti to the individual, but this reading to me feels like it actually gives a lot to the artist, and in the case of this talk, to the rotoscope artist in particular, to kind of say, hey, use these things that are happening and let's see how we can use them to form a critique and to question and to explore. Okay, so that's Hal Foster. Quickly, in terms of remixing the image in this section of the talk, again, these are all of these films show up on the list that I sent you, but these are just a few filmmakers that I think kind of exist in that space of the postmodern approach to rotoscoping and to remixing images. To gain something or to question things or to reframe things. So that you might be seeing something that you're familiar with culturally or socially or historically, but then when seen in this new way, through this new lens, something new might come from it, or it might take on a new kind of critical element. And so if you haven't seen any of the work by these filmmakers, I recommend checking it out. Like I said, these are all on the list that I sent. So check that out. So I quickly wanted to just talk about my own relationship to this notion of remixing the image. And again, being in my second year of really going through working with the rotoscope practice. Yeah, as I said at the beginning of this section, this was the first time that I had really approached working with images that were not my own. And so I started to do these little, these loops. And these are just two of like a number of them. But these loops come from the film Badlands by Terrence Malick. I think it was at 1978. I don't remember the year, but yeah, this is from Badlands by Terrence Malick. And you know, when approaching this, I was trying to think about you know, this image that the main character Kit kind of represents in American culture, and like the critique of that image is built into that film already, of course, but which is this idea that like Kit is sort of a mirror of this kind of like lineage of this kind of rugged individual, kind of masculine male, kind of Americana figure. And he's based off of real, in the film, for those of you that haven't seen it, it's sort of this guy Kit and his girlfriend, and they go on this sort of murderous kind of dreamy rampage across the Midwest that is kind of fraught with a bunch of different trials and tribulations. It's a really wonderful film and incredibly beautiful. But anyhow, there's this kind of lineage built into this film of like real life examples of people living this way in American culture, and then also like other film stars kind of representing this kind of like masculine male individual, kind of like on a bad road, bad boy kind of character, and how it sort of feels like a cultural loop that that is somehow American. And I think that we can obviously see that today with any number of things that have gone on over the last year or few years when it comes to the you know, horrible gun violence and different ways that sort of maybe like white male kind of masculinity has kind of proven to be extremely dangerous. And so I think that you know, we see these things kind of throughout culture. And so I was thinking about, is there a way perhaps that can be like called forward with rotoscoping and trapping these characters in some sort of a loop that I feel like has some sort of like maybe iconic quality to the image itself that speaks outside of the film. You know, of course, it's up to you all viewing my work to decide whether or not that's even there, or that you would ever pick up on that, or if you think it's working. I'm not trying to say that like that is the only read, but anyhow, that's at least what was going through my mind when making this work and trying to think through how can I approach, as someone working with rotoscoping, my relationship to like a received image or an already existing image, and what can be maybe used with it to gain some new perspective. And so here's this first example of that. Yeah. Okay, and this also ended up turning into a bit of like an installation with a few different videos and things like that, which you can see online. Cool. And so then sticking with this notion of remixing the image, I also then spent a little bit of time rotoscoping cartoons and like existing animation, which I think probably sounds a little bit like sacrilegious or like a faux pas. And it's something that I do think is, I don't know, it's a funny thing to do. But I was curious about it. And as show up on the list that I gave you, there are a number of artists that kind of work in that mode already. And so I wanted to try this myself and to see kind of how a contemporary viewpoint can reshape like a historical animation. And that's something that both Laura Mulvey and John Berger kind of talk about a lot in those two texts that I shared, is this notion of like the way that our contemporary moment, our contemporary technology actually help us like rethink about and think through the past. And so yeah, you know, on the left, I'll kind of talk through this quickly because I'm trying to be mindful of the time. But we have in this clip, you know, I made the one on the left shortly after the murder of George Floyd and the beginning of the Black Lives Matter uprisings in, I guess it was 2020. And so, you know, it was a very heightened political extreme moment. And, you know, I was feeling, I think, along with everyone else, a very strong sense of sort of injustice and the ways that these institutional systems of oppression and racism and violence sort of operate and have always operated. And so I was at that same time watching some old Disney cartoons and was watching this one in particular where there's this sort of mad scientist character who has captured Mickey, and there's this moment where he kind of pulls his robe off and then goes into sort of work on Mickey, and all I could see in that moment was my contemporary perspective, which was a character pulling off a sort of a pointed white robe to reveal something underneath. And of course, my mind naturally went to sort of this kind of KKK type character and then a police officer underneath, because that is something that we have seen being the case in a number of ways in American culture or society. So I couldn't not see that, and so I decided, hey, I'm just going to rotoscope it, and then also I'm going to embellish the original image. And so I added those kind of like police paraphernalia, and I simplified the image a little bit to kind of push the view that I was seeing. Something else I also did with both of these clips was add a ton of in-betweens to these original pieces of animation, which I don't really know how that relates to a lot of this talk, but I will say that it was really fun. I don't know, there's something that I was really like, it was just like really enjoyable to add a bunch of in-betweens between a piece of classic animation regardless. Yeah, that's where that clip in the middle comes from there. But then in the front of it, I decided to place this sequence from Susan Pitt's Asparagus, another classic piece of independent and experimental animation from the United States. But the average, or not average, but someone that doesn't really have, I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of people might not see that's what that's from, and that's okay. But for me, it's this moment where the character in Asparagus is pulling back the curtain to look out into her garden, her kind of magical garden in the beginning of the film, and I wanted to place it there because it's sort of this idea of sort of, at least for me, like pulling back the curtain, revealing something, laying something bare. And then, of course, in the background, we have this clip from Sally Cruikshank's film, another American independent animator, Quasi at the Quackadero, and it's this kind of sequence of this character sort of looking daggers, literally shooting daggers out of their eyes at another character. And so and this kind of operates in a similar function of like, okay, now that you've been revealed, derobed, we're watching you, or like you're being watched and criticized. And so, there's a lot of these things kind of built into this one little loop that, again, I don't know if most of the people seeing it, viewing it would really pick up on that. And that's all right. But at least that's sort of, for me, where that remix came in, and where pulling all those things together into one image worked for me. And then quickly on the right, I made this one a few months later during the election cycle here in the United States. And, it was a really strange, contentious election that obviously got blown out into this crazy thing. And so I decided to rotoscope this sequence from Piotr Kamler, one of his films called Le Pas, which is this really great film of all these pieces of paper kind of moving around. And so I rotoscoped this little sequence, and I made it loop of these pieces of paper just kind of interacting with each other, thinking about kind of ballots and maybe like a left-right divide or something. And then also I decided to throw the character from the little Bill character from the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill segment to kind of, again, place us within this idea of like electoral politics and, I don't know, gridlock and the way that things do or don't change politically. And then, of course, I decided to throw this kind of circular motif that Susan Pitt uses a lot, or at least a few times in Asparagus, just to kind of frame them nicely. So okay, I'm going to keep moving forward, but yeah, I just wanted to give you those two examples of the way that I've kind of like contended with this notion of remixing images, and maybe the possibilities as a rotoscope artist that can come from that, and particularly thinking about it through this lens of like a language of images, and then this language of like a postmodern approach to those images. Okay. So now this is going to be like the second half of the talk, I suppose, which is getting to this notion of demystifying the image. And then also in particular, like contextualizing that within the body of work that I created, and I'm sort of finalizing now with my thesis work. And I have this subtitle here, Demystifying the Image, but then in parentheses, or being an image detective, which is a lot more fun sounding, and is actually like a term that one of my mentors very nicely gave to me about my work, which was very sweet. But I do think it sort of is a way of approaching it that feels like very at the heart of what I'm trying to get at with a lot of the ideas in this talk. So let's get into Roland Barthes for a second, who another writer from the 20th century. There's like a ton to say about Roland Barthes and his writing and his ideas that obviously we don't have the time to really get into here, but this book in particular, Mythologies, was incredibly like was a pretty, I read it maybe a year ago, a year and a half ago, and it was pretty foundational for me when starting to really get into some of these bigger ideas about the way that I approach rotoscoping and a way that I approach thinking about images and culture and politics and media. And just to kind of quickly break down some of what his ideas are, I mean, he was coming out of this kind of like structural kind of analysis tradition in 20th century theory and thinking, but also he was really big into ideas of semiotics. And so, and if for those of you that aren't that familiar with semiotics, I really don't know if I have the time to really fully break it down, but it's sort of about this relationship between culture and the individual and signs and symbols, in that there are ways that we kind of construct meaning through language and through images daily, basically to make sense of how something is given meaning and what something means. He would say that something like, a cup only means cup through like our socialized culture of that. Really terrible short kind of breakdown of semiotics, but regardless, he's also looking at the way that meaning is produced culturally and socially and politically. And so in this book, Mythologies, it kind of combines a number. He used to do this weekly column in some French newspaper where he would do these little things called mythologies. And so he would look at culture, look at society, and then he would break down what he thought of as these kind of mythic moments, these ways that power structures or companies or political parties or whatever it might be, we're sort of structuring things to look maybe conventional or normal or obvious when presented a certain way. But and if you didn't have the critical lens to view it through, the average person may not pick up on that. And so in that way, it can be very deceptive. Myth is like a deceptive force that something, say like a political government that wants to remain in power would utilize to make their regime seem very normal and natural. And I think this is something that we see obviously still today. We see myth kind of being shot out of every different institution in various ways. But if we try to think about like the ways that contemporary politicians and media organizations try to normalize their message, normalize their way of looking at the world, so that if you don't think that way, or maybe if you feel like you're in opposition to that, it can set up this tension of like, oh, am I not normal, or is this something not right? This also works within advertising, and this is like, maybe he breaks down a number of different advertisements in this book, but this sense that an advertising image is made to present a very normal, conventional thing, or something that looks normal and conventional, but so that you, the reader, so you the viewer, think to yourself, well, am I not normal because I don't buy that brand of soap? Because it's very normal. So these are some quick breakdowns of this idea of myth and the way that Roland Barthes is approaching it. The reason he was doing this at this time, though, is because in the early, this was written in 57, or it was compiled in 57, but was written throughout the 40s and the 50s. And this is a time when mass media, mass culture, mass kind of consumer culture was pretty new at the time. And in like the average kind of lay person experience, it might not be obvious to a lot of people that large government bodies, political affiliations, media companies might not always have the individual's best interest in mind when producing a piece of media, and that actually everything they produce is highly constructed, and what Roland Barthes would say is mythic. It has some mythic element to it that is obscuring the actual reality of what's underneath, the lived actual reality, to present this kind of mythic ideology that they would like to perpetuate. So anyway, that was a lot to kind of sum up quickly, but I'll read this quote now, and then we'll get into it. He says, I must apply to myth a static method of deciphering. In short, I must go against its own dynamics. To sum up, I must pass from the state of reader to that of mythologist. And this little quote is it's in the second half of the book, and it's where he's talking about the role of what he calls the mythologist, or really what his position was when breaking down these myths, which is contending with the images of culture, contending with the media saturation, and then being able to look past to just being sort of like an active viewer or reader, as he calls it, and then to go beyond that, to be able to decipher it, to be able to demystify it, or to look through the myth. And he calls this position of being a mythologist, or what I would say being an image detective, perhaps. And I wanted to now bring it back to that John Berger quote for just a second, in that, you know, if we think again about this idea of the reader or the text being that of like an earlier time, maybe other centuries, and that now we have a language of images, and it's important what we do with those images, then someone like Barth's call to arms, and then Roland Barthes' notion of the mythologist sort of go hand in hand, in that as a rotoscope artist, or as someone that's contending with images as a form, and also their constructedness through the rotoscope process, that you can enter very easily into this space of being a mythologist, being one that breaks down an image and can kind of crack open actually what's going on within the image, and to try to form new relationships through that, and in a way be sort of, be your own mythologist, or create your own like little mythologies, as Barth has written in his book, not to create new myths, but to sort of dispel and lay bare in this very structural way the myths that are set out by society. So I hope that made sense with people. We can talk a little bit more about that if anyone has questions, but to kind of go forward, I wanted to just break down now, with all of that in mind, the way that I approached my thesis work, which contends with, I think, all of these ideas kind of built in together, but in particular, this sort of last notion of deciphering, being a detective in a sense. And so, sorry to pull up maybe some of these images, which folks have been maybe trying to forget, but this is really where the beginning of my thesis work began, and the beginning of my work maybe as an image detective began. And so what I'll say is that before COVID, before everything that happened after the quarantines began, my thesis work was actually going to be about, still based on some of Roland Barthes' ideas, in thinking about semiotics and the way that we relate to meaning, and constructed meaning culturally, socially, and personally. And it was going to be about objects. It was going to be about the way that we that an individual or groups of people can have different relationships to objects, and how perspective and movement changes that relationship and that meaning, and sort of what is and isn't in view. And so that was sort of what I had been pitching to my thesis committee. And then of course, COVID happened, George Floyd was murdered, uprisings happened, incredible amount of other crazy, wild political things began to just sort of stack on top of each other. And it became pretty clear to me in that moment that I wasn't going to be able to continue working the way I had set out with my thesis work. And so I knew that I needed to sort of pivot, and that it was important to me in that moment to contend some way with sort of the current moment. And this isn't to say that I think every artist needs to do that, or every artist needs to suddenly be making like quote unquote political work or something in that vein, but it felt important to me in that moment to do that. And I just knew that I wasn't going to actually be able to like go back and make a film that didn't touch on this some way. And of course, I do think anyone that's made work in the last 2 years, year and a half, whatever it is, I think that a lot of these ideas will show up naturally in a lot of ways in people's work, even if it's not like overt. So anyhow, with that out of the way, I just wanted to sort of, this is where my transition started to begin here, with the way I was looking at the work now, going from like sort of everyday, maybe kind of common objects that I was going to be working with, and now trying to think, okay, well, what were the objects of 2020? What were the objects then of that moment, 2020, 2021? And at the time, and maybe still so, things like face masks and flags and banners, and signs, and any of those things were like very clearly these very visible ways that people were signaling, were signifying, were communicating meaning to each other on both sides of the political spectrum, of course, maybe a little bit more on the right, with this strange fascination with Trump flags, of course, and then also Blue Lives Matter flags. But regardless, this is where I started to begin to try to like contend with this. Okay, how can I, what could I do as a filmmaker, but also trying to continue using the rotoscope technique? How can I apply this idea of trying to break down and decipher all of this meaning making going on through these like very kind of, at their root, very simple forms? I mean, these are pieces of fabric that are been just applied all of this meaning on top of them. And so I was sort of curious about that at first, and I didn't really have a real direction. So I just started to kind of work in a bunch of different ways with images to try to see what sense I could make of them. Oh, we'll go back here for a second. I don't know if I can hit play. Oh yeah, now they're all playing. But yeah, as you can see, really none of these, I don't think have ended up in the final piece at all. But you know, on the top left, I have this flag sequence that was sort of me just rotoscoping the blue line out of a sequence of a number of blue line flags to see, I don't know if there's something there. And then on the top right, I'm working with the Roto Brush tool in After Effects, trying to see if I can sift through tons and tons of footage and just pull out these different objects and these meaning making devices and see if isolating them kind of pulls something out of them in some way or deciphers something about them. And then in the bottom left, you can see I'm just working with kind of my usual mode, which is this kind of hand-drawn rotoscope aesthetic and just picking very specific pieces of what to include. It's a little bit hard to see what's going on there, but it's sort of someone pointing a temperature gun at someone else who's wearing a mask. And then on the bottom right, you see there, this is like, you know, a way that I don't work, more of like a replacement animation technique. But there was a while where I was really curious about this kind of transition of kind of like a gun motif or a trigger kind of pointing at people motif that sort of seemed like it started off in like a banal enough way with temperature guns, and then had this weird trajectory into like things like like the church. And then of course, as we saw, continued to go on to be extremely violent and dangerous with real guns and weapons. And so I was really trying hard to track these things and to make connections between them and to see how working with them could reveal or demystify some aspect of their connection. And I was also trying to think about the way that a broader culture and a political organization or any of these things were actively kind of distributing, controlling, or disseminating these images and these ideas in this sense that Barth is getting at, this sense of like a myth, the way that a government might want to make something feel right and natural and normal, like a number of different types of flags that you would see you know, everywhere. If that feels normal for everyone to be using them, then all of a sudden, you know, they're everywhere, and the sort of power that has. And so I was trying to track these like different levels of meaning making going on socially, culturally, politically. But then there was this kind of transitional moment in the production where it was just purely through trying a lot out, where I started to, I was talking about this idea of like holding weapons and stances and things like that. And on the right-hand side, it's really cropped, but what you see is on the left, a priest who's holding a water gun, which became this kind of like popular early quarantine meme of like priests are shooting babies with holy water, which I don't know, I like to have a sense of humor, but it's a little dark. And so especially just because of like the kind of like weird conservative right undertones to a lot of like the way that they reacted to quarantine and COVID and such like that. But then here on the right is a police officer, a riot police officer pointing what you know is known as like a less lethal gun at a father and a child who are out of the frame. But I was just really drawn to how similar their stance was and the similar color, which just so kind of happened to be. And then on the left, you can see that I've just kind of really quickly worked with their silhouettes to try to understand that relationship as well. And this got me to thinking a lot about maybe like where these learned patterns come from of that, like, why would a priest hold a gun that way? Or like, is there something about the culture that that would seem normal or obvious? And I began thinking a lot about just sort of, again, this idea of like ingrained masculinity, things like violent, like sport, movies, video games, superheroes, a lot of these things that are kind of like in one way or another kind of conditioning, especially sort of like white male kind of disaffected people to like kind of this way. Of course, I'm reading a lot into this, and there's a lot more of the research that you're not seeing, but sort of where I was going with this. And it led to, those ideas were sort of swirling around, and there was a lot. And when you're trying to make a film, of course, there's a moment where you just need to start making the film, like actually start making the film, of course. And it was coming to be about like halfway through. It was nearly the end of my time at CalArts, and there's a moment where it's like, hey, are you going to make a film? Like, are you going to graduate? Of course. So I just needed to start working. And so I picked a clip, which was that I was interested in working with. I knew I wanted to rotoscope kind of in this very kind of like highly rendered sort of detailed way. And I chose this clip. This is from I think the first protest after George Floyd was murdered here in Los Angeles. This is pretty horrific clip of a cop sort of swinging his baton at just a crowd of people. This is a protest that I did happen to be at, and one that I also was struck by police at with their batons. And so I had my own sort of personal connection to this clip and this moment, but also just sort of this striking imagery that I felt like had a lot of power and had a lot of things like kind of built into it. And I was just curious about like, okay, if I start working with it, what is there, what could come from it, and like what is kind of built into that clip. And anyone that's worked with rotoscoping before, worked with imagery, worked with animation, I mean, rather than imagery, knows that like it takes forever, and it's a very long process. And so about halfway through rotoscoping the sequence, it was like probably 3 or 4 hours into it, I kind of got to this moment right here that you're seeing on screen, which is this police officer kind of midway through his swing. And at that time, bringing it all the way back to this notion of like looking at images, at this moment in that process, a few hours in, I'm not really thinking about what is the context of the clip anymore. I'm not thinking about really anything except for, I know the shape I'm trying to get, I know the form I'm trying to get, the level of rendering I'm trying to achieve. And that's really what I'm thinking more in like formal compositional elements at this point. And I kind of sat back and I thought to myself, okay, well, like if I didn't know that where this came from, and I didn't know this was a police officer swinging a baton, I might think that this was someone swinging a baseball bat, because it really looks similarly with sort of this, a bat shape and then the helmet and gear, and so that was like the spark moment for me of this change, where I was like, oh, well, that's actually the connection for me, is to a broader culture and to something that's speaking outside of the image, and especially the constructedness of these images, the fact that this is coming from a national news source on TV, on YouTube, and that these are the same news organizations that are also constructing other views of culture and society sort of on a daily basis. And so I then quickly went and found a video clip in a similar kind of framing on YouTube of a baseball player swinging a bat. And then I started rotoscoping that sequence, and decided, I wanted to see if I could do some sort of match cut between the two, and maybe see what comes of that. And I believe I have that here. Yeah. Let that play a few times. And so, this was a pretty big turning point for me in the process of making this connection, making these kind of these moments, these match cuts, which ended up, you might, I'll be able to show you a short clip from my film that you'll see kind of how the film is built that way, kind of popping between these different modes, and how for me, it became a way of deciphering, a way of demystifying, a way of working as a mythologist by saying, oh, I don't actually need to fully break down this image into its component parts, but actually it's through breaking down a number of different images from parts of culture that allow me to like create this new whole that will force a viewer to kind of see juxtapositions that they may not always contend with in their like daily relation to media, but that I believe actually has a lot of connections. And that if we think about sort of this kind of masculine American kind of like straight male kind of upbringing that is kind of filtered through things like sports and physicality and aggression, and then also think about how those trajectories are kind of reinforced by things like television, shows on television, movies, video games, and then also the sort of the pipeline to also going right into the military or the police force for a lot of people as well. And thinking about how all of these things are actually extremely connected, and that it's even possible that like, you know, a a riot police officer swinging his baton may even be like thinking about when he was playing baseball. Of course, that's me reading into it a lot, but like I wouldn't doubt that there's some part of that in there. And so that's really sort of how I started to build the rest of this film out. And the film isn't done yet. As many, I think anyone who was in school and trying to make work over the last, trying to finish up school during quarantine knows it was extremely challenging and very hard to continue making work and stay focused and to be on your ball. And in my case, I was trying to stay so up to date with sort of what was going on politically, socially, that it was really hard to like sort of draw a line and have a cutoff point. And so all of that to say that the film is still sort of in its final stages of production, and that hopefully it will be showing up in the world in the next part of the year. So we'll see. But I do have a short clip here just to show you the way that I've started to build the film out. This is just a small little segment that represents sort of maybe like the quote unquote baseball section of the film. And then we'll kind of wrap it up from there. So let me play this. There is sound.
And got a chance to see how the officers were sharing their knowledge of baseball.
The crowd just erupts in a chant of USA. There is nothing like it that I've ever experienced at a ball. It was overwhelming. It was just overwhelming.
And I'll tell you what's going on. The crowd is chanting USA.
Okay, so that's just a short clip there that kind of gives you a taste of the direction of the film kind of after this moment. But this is more or less the end of the talk here. I'm not really sure how long I've gone on for at this point. But I don't really have much more to add to that, but to say that there's more coming. But I did want to make a point about working with sort of maybe challenging imagery and like breaking images down in a way that has some sort of respect for what's being depicted. Just because I know that we've had there's like a lot going on with sort of like viewing trauma over the last couple of years, and I made the choice with this project to depict only sort of the officers or those perpetrating sort of the violence, in an effort to like not only like not re-show some of these things, but because I think that oftentimes when looking at this type of work, it can be extremely cheap, essentially, to depict the sort of like the innocent person, the victim, and really actually does a lot more harm than good. And that actually a process of demystifying and deciphering is actually, I think, more in tune with trying to break down like the structure and like this sort of system that is around the victim. And in the case of this film, it's sort of this, as I've gotten at, this kind of framework of this this culture and society that somehow normalizes things like police violence and other things like that. So maybe I'll end it there. But yeah, I hope that was useful. I'll stop sharing and maybe we can do some questions and answers. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
That was incredible. Thank you so much. Also, thank you for sharing a piece of your thesis with us. I know it's about 9:15, so if people wanted to throw questions in the chat or unmute to ask, we'll do like 5 to 10 minutes of questions before we end tonight.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm wondering how it was for you to work with the footage of the police, because it's I mean, I heard some friends who work in the newspapers, and they also always mention that it's very hard for them to constantly be looking at very violent content. So I wonder how it was for you to work with those images.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's definitely one that was yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the folks that you were just talking about. It was very hard. I mean, anyone that is tuning in, I know some of you here, I know that were around me over the last year. It was really hard, and you know, I don't want to like take that on as like, you know, it's a choice that I made, but it is hard to see so much violent imagery and to make that choice and to kind of like allow yourself to go into that space. And there was a while I don't think I realized how harmful it was like for my mental health to be like in that space sort of on a daily, weekly basis, which is why I did need to like draw a cutoff point to where there's always going to be more footage and more sort of unfortunately terrible things happening. But there's a point where like it's actually not about, in a way, it's not about these hyper specific things. It becomes like more about picking the ones that kind of speak to the larger piece at whole. And that was a way for me to kind of take a step back a little bit. But I will say, I mean, there's no easy way to like talk around it. Like it was extremely challenging. There were days that I was just like incredibly bummed out. I mean, not just bummed out, I mean, just horrified, you know, like it was challenging. And I think I'm not alone. I think we all kind of experienced that in our own way over the last year. But I do caution anyone that maybe wants to contend with similar type of work to really check in with your mental health and to make sure that like you're not you know, digging yourself into a hole that is hard to get out of and can be like very unhealthy. So I don't know if I have a proper answer, but I will just say, yeah, it was very hard. And in a way, it's sort of, I almost feel like I need to go back to my cohort who I was presenting to weekly and say, guys, I know that I was in some dark days at that time. And so I'm glad you all kind of like worked with me in those moments, but yeah.
Amazing. There's a question in the chat, two questions. One, what is your setup and process like for rotoscoping on paper, as well as a question about your creative process and planning for pre and post production.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if those kind of combine.
Yeah. So the way I work with rotoscoping on paper is like very, I guess maybe very direct. Really, I just tape a peg bar to my laptop. Or at least is how I started with it when I was like my first year film, the one that I started with there, it's a film called Driftless. It's on my Vimeo. That film, I had like a 2011 MacBook Pro I was still using at the time, and I didn't really, you know, it wasn't that attached to it anymore as far as like a piece of technology. And so I just taped a peg bar to the screen and kind of flipped it upside down so I could just draw right onto it like a light box, and just worked kind of using the keys there to go forward a frame or two. So that's the way that I worked for probably the first 2 years of rotoscoping. And I like doing it that way because it's just direct. Like if you have your laptop on you and a peg bar and some paper, like you can kind of work anywhere. And then for the last year, I kind of upgraded a little bit. And I just off of Craigslist got this like kind of cheap monitor. And I just attached that to my laptop now with an HDMI cable. And I again flip it over so it sort of works as like a light table. And I just tape a peg bar to that. So yeah, for me, it's a pretty direct process of just peg bar on screen. Oh yeah, and then planning and pre-production. I mean, as you may have gathered from that last part of the talk, I'm a little bit averse to like real true pre-production, and it's definitely maybe a bit of a weak point, one that I'm trying to like think about as I move forward, trying to make more work. But the way that I think that I naturally gravitate towards sort of like research and analysis and reading and things like that. But I've really been pushed by the faculty at school to say, hey, stop thinking so much and just start working, which is very hard to do. But I do actually think that is always the biggest turning point in any pre-production for me, is like when I say, okay, I kind of know what I want to do, but now let me just put pencil to paper and actually start drawing or actually start working with the footage, because that's a moment where everything's really going to change and you're going to realize like what you can and can't do in that moment. And so I don't have like a real pre-production process of like storyboarding or anything like that, but I'd say it kind of comes about through doing a lot of like little tinkering, and then also on sort of my own end, like some writing and reading and things like that. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. I think I answered that question. Yeah.
Amazing. Anyone else?
I have a quick question. Slash just sorry. First of all, thank you so much for that talk. It was wonderful, and my first time at an after hours animation event in person. Really, really fantastic stuff. So thank you, Jonah. So much of the theory and material you were talking us through was like really enlightening to listen through. You know, there's this idea that like, I mean, not idea, it's like in cinema and in film, so much of time is defined by like activity and movement and, you know, change that makes something feel logical, you know, provides this like logical sense that we understand a film or a sequence through. And I think, you know, I was just thinking about like using that as like source material for animation and how that affects like the way that time is read in sequences like the ones you've made. But I'm just wondering if you can speak to, like, you mentioned this in the question that you just answered too, but as you're animating, there seem to be these moments where you're working with this source material, this source footage. There's like one particular event or like a thing that happened. And then another source material is brought in because there's a moment where you realize that there's another point in time, another totally different thing that seems to in some way remind you or match a part of that experience. And just as part of like the animation process, how does like the post-production of like, because at the end of the day, you're making like a film with all of these different discrete moments and films and shots, right? But how does like the editing of all of those like separate moments work? And especially someone mentioned it in the chat too, like when sound comes in, there's like a whole new world that you're like constructing and sort of imparting with all of this new information. So I'm just wondering what is going through your head as you're editing the final film together.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Really
long
really,
question.
No, it's okay. No, it's really thought out and there's a lot there. And I do want to say that, like, off the top, that I think anybody working really with film in general, but also animation maybe in particular, of course, there's like this weird modulation of time at play where like it's something that happens so quickly or is played back so quickly, but you, the editor, you, the animator, are working through it in a way that slows that down like tremendously. And so there's always this strange kind of disconnect and modulation of time there that I think everyone kind of contends with in their own way. But in the case of my work, yeah, like you're right that there has been a lot of these moments that come through working that kind of change the production and like kind of set it on the path that it will become. And I think it does go back to that first question of just starting to work. But it's a challenge. It has been challenging, which is why I'm maybe trying to get a little bit more into pre-production. In that, like, the first year film, yeah, I built it just totally like free form. Like, I just chose a bunch of shots, kind of like whatever, and was just rotoscoping them. And I built up like a giant stack. And I was like, okay, well, I guess this is the film. Then I need to put it together now. And so it was a lot of editing. And I actually really do enjoy editing. I think it's a lot of fun. There's a lot that can come out of it. And that's how the first film was built, was just throwing everything on a timeline and sort of deciding how it could go together, if things should repeat or not. And like if there was some sort of natural flow of material. But I do think it's a challenging way of working, in that, like, if you get to that point and you realize you're missing something, and if you say you have a deadline or something, it could be pretty dramatic or devastating if, like, you're like, oh shit, like I need to go back and do a bunch more work or something, or there's something really totally missing here. And then in the case of this newest film, I was trying to be more purposeful with the planning. After I sort of had that moment of like, okay, I get what this film is going to look like now, and I know how I want to work with these juxtapositions and this editing, I then had this massive library of source footage that I just kept adding to over like the course of 6 or 8 months. And I just really was going through and just trying to find little moments that I could work with. And I had sort of broken everything down to these different these segments, like I don't know, police or flags or whatever it might be, and different sports and things. And so I would just kind of pick through those and try to build a little bit of a video edit first to say, okay, like if I rotoscope this and make these connections, like it should work if I edit it all together. Of course, like even within that level of construction, there was always still things that happened while rotoscoping or while working that were unexpected. And I think the biggest takeaway for me that I try to tell people is like, so if something like that happens, like, or like just to leave yourself open to those unexpected things, to those like things that come up that you weren't anticipating, because that's usually where the most exciting work is going to come from. And like to be too closed off with your pre-production and post-production is going to like, can potentially like you could lose some pretty exciting moments. And so I always try, if there's something that feels like it comes up in those moments, to just kind of lean into it and go with it, and to not let it like derail me or stress me out because it was unexpected. Yeah, cool. I hope that answered the question.
It definitely did. Thank you.
I have a quick question too. Hi, thanks so much for talking about this. This was really great, and just like a joy on a Tuesday night. But I really like appreciated you, especially diving into just all of the like theory and ways that you think about your work before making things. It was kind of like listening to myself talk about how I make stuff, just because like I also work in a way where like just a lot of reading and citing like a ton of like really conceptual sources, where I just graduated a graduate program where I also all the time had people being like, okay, like stop that and just make stuff. And I'm interested specifically in whether like you personally in your practice have found a meaningful way to not just like have those things fuel what you're making, but like include them, those like really pivotal ideas and the things that you share with an audience, be it like on your website or whatever. Just because like I feel like I personally am in kind of like a constant battle of like, I know that a ton of this is really overwhelming, and like, you know, not everyone is going to care about like everything that I'm thinking about that goes into like every shot that I do, or every like source that I'm using. But at the same time, like those things feel really like heartfelt and important to me. And so I'm curious, like if you have struck a balance in any way personally in conveying those like citations and ideas that like fuel your work before making it to the people who watch it, or sorry, that was
no, that's a great question, and I think it's probably something that most people trying to like have an artistically engaged film practice probably have to contend with at some level. It's a challenge. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there is a point when you do sort of have to like give it up a little bit. Like, I hate to say it that way, but that like, yeah, there's just no way to communicate all of it. And that there are also like, no matter how much you put into that level of thinking and conceptualizing your own piece, like you can't control the way that someone's going to view it, and that they might actually have a 180 degree like different view of what you've made, even if you've like highly constructed every aspect of it. And I do think that ultimately that's what's beautiful about like looking at art and film. But also I totally like understand and like empathize with you of like wanting to communicate those things. And what I would say is that I mean, it might be worthwhile thinking about, I mean, this is something I've been starting to do is to write a little bit more actually about not necessarily my work, but just ideas. Like I'm trying to like, you know, get into some sort of writing practice. I don't know how that will come out into the world, but that's something that's felt meaningful for me, because I do agree with you that I you know, I think there's a lot there that can go unsaid with filmmaking. And so, but something else I know that other artists do, like Annapurna Kumar, for example, who's on that list. It's not necessarily breaking down her like sort of theoretical or conceptual angles, but she sometimes will put out like a little artist book, or like have an artist book that goes along with a film. And I've always found that to be like a really exciting way to like continue the film in like a different form, and to see, I think usually hers end up being a little bit more about like the research and like the little experiments that go into the film, the final film. And so in that way it can kind of like continue that intrigue of like, oh, well, I can see the way that this artist is putting together those pieces, and then now I can watch it on the screen. I do feel that in general, it's tough with filmmaking and maybe like the festival setup. Like, for example, there's an expectation like in a gallery setting that there's a certain amount of context and textual reading that one might have to do before actually fully like contending with the piece of art. And, and that's because that's kind of like the expectation in a gallery setting. I think people are like they're already primed to be like, oh, I'm going to need to read a paragraph or two before I like look at this piece of art. But say you're showing something in a film festival, that's not always the case. And especially within animation, I would say in particular, it's definitely not the case. And so that is a challenge, and I don't really know how to overcome that. But maybe a long-winded way to saying that like there are just going to maybe be some people that are less interested in it. But the other angle actually, one of the more exciting people working with rotoscoping right now, David De La Fuente, he made a film called Guidance that's on the list that I sent everybody. And that film, he really uses text inside of the film in a very interesting way, in a way that really invites you to pause the film and to read the text, which I think is very exciting. And there's actually some quotes from Roland Barthes in that film as well. And so maybe that's a way, maybe literally putting it in the film. And in my own case, I have been getting a little bit more curious about essay film in general, like literally working with text within the film setting. And so that could also be a potential pathway. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Jonah, for all your time this evening. There is a question about grad school, and I have to run too. So I just want to pause that and say, I'm working on putting together a panel of like getting into the industry with self-taught animators, people who went to grad school, people who didn't go to school for animation. So hopefully that event can answer those questions, as well as Jonah's links to his work. Also, since Ellery is here, they are going to be hosting our next event next Tuesday, same time, titled Working in the Lightroom. So just keep your eye out for posting on that. And just once again, thank you so much, Jonah, and everyone who came out this evening for making it such a lovely night.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate you spending your time listening to me. I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you again, McKenna and After Hours.
Of course, have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.